Racist cop kicks out black woman from courtroom, stunned when she's the lead prosecutor. The morning was crisp, with a sky as clear as glass and air that smelled faintly of metal and stone. A steady stream of people moved toward the courthouse steps. Some were early witnesses, others journalists, a few were just curious onlookers. Among them, a woman walked alone. Her shoulders were squared, her head held high, and each step carried the quiet precision of someone who had walked this path 100 times in her mind, if not in real life. Her name was Alexis Monroe. She wore a dark navy blue suit, tailored to her figure, modest but powerful in its design. In her right hand, she held a slim black briefcase. Her heels clicked softly on the courthouse stairs as she ascended. She was neither nervous nor hurried. She had prepared for this day for years, not only through study and law school and years of grinding through small cases, but through every slight and every assumption she had ever endured. As she reached the heavy wooden double doors of the courthouse, she reached for the metal handle. A tall white officer, standing guard, turned toward her. His eyes ran from her face down to the badge clipped to her waist. His lips tightened slightly. "Excuse me, ma'am. This entrance is restricted to legal staff and court officials." Alexis kept her expression calm. "I am a legal staff, Prosecutor Monroe, assigned to the State versus Claiborne case." The officer narrowed his eyes. His gaze lingered on her face, as if trying to search for something. Then he gave a small, dismissive laugh. "You're with the witnesses then? The waiting room is around the back." "No," she said firmly. "I am the lead prosecutor." But he didn't move. Instead, he pointed toward the side entrance, the one used by the general public. "I think you're mistaken. Please head to the public entrance. This door is not for observers." For a brief second, Alexis hesitated. Not because she questioned herself, but because she could feel something ancient and familiar pressing against her chest. A silent injustice that had never been named out loud. A reminder that even with all the badges and titles and degrees in the world, her presence in certain rooms would always require proof. The proof he wanted was not on paper. It was in the color of her skin. She looked at the officer, not with anger, but with an exhaustion so deep it had no bottom. "Understood," she said. She turned and walked away. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't show him her papers again. She didn't argue. Not because he was right, but because he wasn't worth the fight. Around the back of the courthouse, the line for the public entrance was slow and crowded. People gave her strange looks, curious and occasionally judgmental. A woman in a floral dress whispered to the man beside her, probably wondering if Alexis was someone's girlfriend, or perhaps even a defendant. Alexis didn't flinch. She went through security like everyone else, removed her heels, let them scan her bag, waited when they checked her ID twice, longer than they needed to. Inside the building, she made her way through the halls. The courthouse smelled like old paper, polished floors, and nervous sweat. Every sound echoed. Her footsteps, her breath, the low hum of voices waiting for something serious to begin. She arrived at her assigned courtroom just before the doors were open to the public. Through the small window, she could already see the defense team settling in, adjusting their papers, nodding to each other with practiced professionalism. The courtroom was a solemn place. Rows of wooden benches, polished desks, flags behind the judge's bench, and the heavy presence of the law hanging over everyone like a ceiling. But for Alexis, that space wasn't just about justice. It was about reclaiming every room she had ever been told she didn't belong in. As she waited for the doors to open, She remembered the first courtroom she had ever sat in. She had been 8 years old. Her father had been on trial for a crime he didn't commit. The charge was theft. The witnesses were vague. The evidence was thin. But he had been convicted anyway, because he looked the part, because he didn't speak with authority, because the public defender didn't show up until the trial had already started. She had watched from the back row with her mother's hand wrapped tightly around hers, while the gavel came down like a hammer on her childhood. Now, years later, Alexis stood on the other side of that courtroom door. She would be the one who asked the questions. She would be the one who decided what the jury heard. She would be the one who demanded truth. As the bailiff opened the doors and allowed the public inside, Alexis walked in without hesitation. Her heels struck the floor like punctuation marks. She passed the defense team. One of the attorneys glanced up and then did a visible double take. His mouth parted, but he said nothing. Another whispered to his colleague. The sound was low, but the meaning was clear. They hadn't expected her. Neither had the room. The same officer who had turned her away stood inside now, near the judge's bench, his posture straightening as she walked by. His eyes widened, his face draining color. She didn't look at him. She didn't have to. She took her place behind the prosecution's table, set down her briefcase, opened it, took out her files and notes. Everything was in order. She had been preparing this case for months. The evidence was solid. The strategy was sound. The courtroom was just a stage now, and she knew her lines by heart. When the judge entered, the room rose. Alexis rose too, just as she had been trained to do. But inside, something else rose with her. Not pride, not even defiance. Conviction. When the judge called for the state to begin its case, Alexis stepped forward. "Good morning, Your Honor. My name is Alexis Monroe. I represent the state in this matter. I am the lead prosecutor for this trial." The words fell like stones in a silent lake. Somewhere in the back of the room, someone coughed. A whisper cut through the quiet. "She's the prosecutor?" But Alexis didn't flinch. She looked at the jury, looked at the judge, looked at the truth waiting to be spoken. This was her courtroom now, and the door that once tried to shut her out had no power anymore. The courtroom settled into rhythm, the hum of legal procedure moving like a slow current. Witnesses were called, testimonies taken, exhibits introduced. Alexis moved through the case with precision. Her questions were sharp but respectful, her tone calm but firm. She neither raised her voice nor wasted a word. Every sentence was a step forward, a thread woven into the narrative she was building, carefully, relentlessly. But it did not take long for resistance to surface. It started subtly, like the faint scent of smoke in a sealed room. A police officer scheduled to testify suddenly called in sick. A key video file that had been submitted as evidence was found to be corrupted. A report Alexis had requested from Internal Affairs, one that documented a troubling pattern of excessive force by the defendant, was delayed without explanation. She approached the clerk's office and was told it had been misfiled. When she pressed harder, a supervisor stepped in and advised her to be patient and focus on what you already have. Alexis recognized the pattern. It was not a wall, walls could be broken. It was fog. It was bureaucracy. It was systemic resistance that wore the mask of protocol. It was delay and deflection. And it had 1,000 polite excuses but only one real cause. She was pushing into a place she was never meant to be. Later that day, in the narrow hallway outside the courtroom, she stood alone, staring out through a dusty window. Beyond it, the city hummed in indifference. People moved through their days unaware of the quiet war being fought inside this building. Not between lawyers or laws, but between what justice promised and what justice delivered. Her phone buzzed. A message from her assistant. They canceled his statement. Witness has travel conflicts. He said someone came by his house last night. She closed her eyes. The witness in question had been a patrol officer, one of the few willing to testify that the defendant, Officer Claiborne, had a reputation on the force. Short temper, selective arrests, disproportionate force used almost always on suspects of color. Now that testimony was gone. Alexis turned from the window and walked to her office. Inside, she removed her jacket and sat down. The walls were blank, the desk cluttered with files. A half-drunk cup of coffee had gone cold beside a stack of photos, crime scene images from the case. She stared at the photographs, but her mind was somewhere else. Years ago, on a morning like this one, she had watched her father being handcuffed in their front yard. She had been 13. The charge was assault. The truth was a scuffle with a white neighbor who had called her mother a name too vile to repeat. He had served 8 months in county jail before the charges were quietly dropped. No apology, no acknowledgement, just absence. She reached into the drawer and pulled out a worn envelope. Inside it, a photograph, her father in a cheap suit standing proudly in front of a community center. His hands in his pockets, his smile thin but proud. On the back, a sentence written in his blocky handwriting. Keep pushing, even if they say stop. She let the photo rest on her desk and leaned back, breathing in the silence. The next morning, Alexis walked through the courthouse earlier than usual. She stopped by a floor most prosecutors avoided: legal archives. A place where old cases gathered dust and truth was buried under time and labels. She wasn't looking for a smoking gun. She was looking for patterns. She found what she needed in a stack of closed complaints. Anonymous letters, civilian reports, internal warnings that had gone nowhere. It was a paper trail soaked in apathy. When she emerged from the archive, her hands held copies of what the system had tried to forget. That night, she met with an old friend, an attorney long since retired. His name was Harold Davis. He had defended civil rights activists in the 70s, had once been chased from a Mississippi courtroom for quoting the Constitution too loudly. He looked at the files, then looked at her. "You think the jury will care about this?" "They have to," she said. He nodded slowly. "Then show them the whole picture. Don't just try the case. Tell the story. Make them see." Back at home, Alexis sat with her notes. Her legal strategy was already sound. But now she would reshape the narrative. She would not ask the jury to merely convict a man. She would ask them to confront a system, to see what they had been taught not to see. At dawn, she was the first to arrive at the courthouse. When the trial resumed, Alexis brought her fire with her. She called a data analyst to the stand, someone the defense underestimated. The analyst revealed trends, charts, records showing how Officer Claiborne's arrest patterns leaned sharply toward young black men. The defense objected. The judge hesitated. But Alexis argued relevance. Context, pattern, history, overruled. Next, she brought in a retired sergeant. He had served with Claiborne for over a decade and spoke in a gravelly voice that carried weight. "I told them," he said. "I filed reports. He was reckless. He played rough with people who couldn't fight back. Why do you think nothing changed?" The sergeant looked at Alexis. Then he looked at the jury. Because no one wanted to listen to a black cop about a white one. There was a stillness in the room. The jury sat straighter. The defense team fidgeted. Claiborne's eyes narrowed. Alexis looked around. The courtroom was changing. Not in noise or chaos, but in weight. The story was shifting. She was no longer fighting just to be heard. She was being heard. But the storm had only just begun. And in that storm, Alexis stood alone but not afraid. The morning of closing arguments arrived heavy with silence. The courthouse parking lot was still as Alexis stepped out of her car, the sunlight splitting across the windshield like a warning and a promise. Inside, the building throbbed with quiet anticipation. Journalists lined the entrance, whispering over coffee, hands on notepads. Officers stood taller. Clerks moved faster. There was a hum of something unspoken in the air. People knew this case was more than about a man. It was about a mirror. In the hallway outside the courtroom, Alexis stopped for a moment. The officer who had turned her away that first morning was stationed there again. His eyes met hers. He looked away. She didn't. The courtroom was already half full by the time she stepped inside. Jurors sat quietly, hands folded, their expressions unreadable. The judge looked tired but focused. Officer Claiborne sat at the defense table, face tight, jaw clenched. His lawyers whispered, avoiding her gaze. Alexis took her seat. Her notes were stacked beside her, but she didn't reach for them. She didn't need them. When the judge gave the nod, the defense went first. Their closing argument was rehearsed, clinical, impersonal. They painted Claiborne as a man doing his duty, stressed, overworked, victim of misunderstanding. They suggested the prosecution had twisted facts, exaggerated statistics, weaponized context. They appealed to the jury's comfort, to the idea that law and order could not survive if every decision made under pressure was dissected. When it was her turn, Alexis stood slowly. She stepped toward the jury and paused. They expect me to talk about the law, she said, and I will. But first, I'm going to talk about the look on a mother's face when she sees her son thrown to the ground for walking home with a hoodie. I'm going to talk about the quiet nod a black father gives his daughter when she says she wants to go to law school. That nod that says, I know the road will try to break you, but walk it anyway. She turned to look at Claiborne. This man didn't just abuse power. He counted on silence. He counted on no one looking closely, on people believing his word because of his badge and disbelieving his victim because of his skin. She raised a single photo in her hand. The victim's body, face bruised, dignity shattered. He did this because he thought no one would care. She walked slowly across the courtroom. But now you know. Now you see. She paused in front of the jury. The law says excessive force is not just illegal, it is immoral. The law says justice belongs to all of us. But justice does not happen by accident. It happens when people choose to see clearly and act bravely. Her voice did not rise. It didn't need to. You don't just hold this man accountable. You remind this courtroom what justice is supposed to mean. She turned and returned to her table, leaving the courtroom full of breathless silence. The jury filed out. Hours passed. Outside, clouds had gathered. A thin mist hung in the air like a held breath. Reporters typed furiously on their phones. The clerk's desk sat empty. The hallway had never felt so long. Inside, Alexis waited. She didn't check her phone. She didn't pace. She sat still, hands on her lap, her father's photo tucked into her pocket. Finally, the jury returned. 12 faces, all unreadable. The bailiff called the room to order. The foreman stood. We, the jury, in the matter of the state versus Officer William Claiborne, find the defendant guilty. The word dropped like a gavel, like thunder, like history cracking open. Alexis felt it hit her chest, not as triumph, but as truth finally catching up to time. The judge spoke. The room moved. Claiborne turned pale. The defense team slumped. Reporters ran. But Alexis stayed still. As the room emptied, the officer from the first day stepped toward her. He stood awkwardly, unsure. "Ma'am, I didn't realize." She looked him straight in the eyes. "You didn't want to." He looked away. She didn't. Later that night, Alexis walked the courthouse steps alone. The city pulsed around her, indifferent and awake. She stood beneath a flickering street lamp and looked up into the dark sky. This case would not fix the system, but it cracked it. And sometimes, justice doesn't start with a roar. Sometimes it starts with a door. One they tried to close, and a woman who walked through it anyway. If the story moved you, if it made you think, if it opened your eyes to something deeper, then don't forget to subscribe. Because on this channel, we don't just tell stories. We reveal truths. We speak for the unheard. And we shine light where the world looks away. Subscribe now and be part of something powerful. New stories, real voices, every week.